My name is Jamal Robinson, and if you would have told me 15 years ago that I'd be preaching salvation instead of running the south side of Chicago, I would have laughed in your face, right before I had you handled. But God has a way of taking the worst stories and turning them into the most powerful testimonies. Let me start from the beginning, because you can't understand the miracle without knowing the madness. I was born in 1985 to a white woman named Sarah from Houston, Texas, and a black man named Marcus who disappeared before I took my first breath. My mama was a junkie, not the kind that hides it well, but the kind that shoots up in McDonald's bathrooms and leaves her mixed-race baby crying in the car while she chases her next high. For the first 5 years of my life, we moved around Chicago like tumbleweeds. One week we'd be crashing at some trap house in Englewood. The next week we'd be sleeping in abandoned buildings in North Lawndale. My mama would disappear for days, leaving me with strangers who barely knew my name, let alone cared if I ate or had clean clothes. The night that changed everything happened when I was 5 years old. We were staying in some roach-infested apartment on 79th and Ashland, right in the heart of what everybody called the trenches. My mama had been gone for 3 days, and I was eating cereal with water because there was no milk when I heard her stumbling up the stairs. But she wasn't alone. She came through that door with 2 men I'd never seen before, all of them high out of their minds. Within minutes, they were arguing about money, about drugs, about God knows what else. Then I heard something that still haunts my nightmares. My mama telling one of those men he could have the kid to settle a debt. I didn't understand what that meant then, but I knew it wasn't good. So I did what any scared 5-year-old would do. I hid under the bed and prayed to a God I barely knew. That's when I heard the sirens. Agent Patricia Williams of the DEA was conducting a raid on our building that night, looking for a major supplier who was using our address as a stash house. When she kicked down her door, she found my mama passed out on the couch and me hiding under a mattress that smelled like death and broken dreams. Agent Williams, Pat, as I came to call her, was a black woman from the West Side who had pulled herself out of the same kind of poverty I was drowning in. Instead of just processing me through the system like another casualty of the drug war, she did something that federal agents aren't supposed to do. She cared. My mama got arrested that night and eventually sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. I never saw her again alive. Pat became my unofficial guardian, navigating the foster care system to make sure I ended up with people who would actually take care of me instead of just cashing checks. I landed with Miss Geneva Robinson, a 70-year-old church mother who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Bronzeville. Miss Geneva had raised 6 kids of her own and fostered dozens more over the years. She was the kind of woman who could make you feel loved and terrified at the same time. Loved because she genuinely cared, terrified because she didn't play when it came to education, respect, and staying out of trouble. For the first time in my life, I had structure. Breakfast every morning before school, homework at the kitchen table every evening, church every Sunday, whether I wanted to go or not. Miss Geneva enrolled me at a decent elementary school and made sure I understood that education was my ticket out of the neighborhood that had swallowed so many young black men. But the streets of Chicago don't let you go easy, especially when you're a mixed-race kid trying to find your place in a world that sees you as too black for white people and too white for some black people. The older kids in the neighborhood tested me constantly, trying to figure out if I was weak because I lived with an old church lady or if I had fight in me. I learned to fight because I had to. Chicago's South Side in the 1990s was like a war zone where children learned survival tactics before they learned multiplication tables. By the time I was 10, I could spot undercover police, identify rival gang colors, and navigate the complex social dynamics that determined whether you walked home safely or ended up in an ambulance. Miss Geneva tried her best to keep me on the right path. She'd drive me to school every morning, pick me up every afternoon, and keep me busy with church activities, homework, and chores that left little time for street nonsense. But she was fighting a losing battle against an environment that was designed to consume young men who looked like me. The first crack in my foundation came when I was 11. Some older kids from the neighborhood started pressuring me to prove myself by stealing from local stores. When I refused, they jumped me after school, leaving me with a black eye and a bloody nose. Miss Geneva wanted to call the police, but I knew that would only make things worse. That's when I made my first mistake. I decided to handle it myself. I started carrying a pocket knife, not because I wanted to hurt anybody, but because I was tired of being an easy target. The next time those kids came for me, I was ready. I didn't stab anybody, but I made it clear that I wasn't going to be anybody's victim. Word spread through the neighborhood that the mixed kid who lived with Miss Geneva had heart. Older gang members started noticing me, not as a target, but as potential recruitment. They'd offer me small amounts of money to run errands, deliver messages, be a lookout while they handled business. Miss Geneva saw what was happening and tried to intervene. She enrolled me in after-school programs, signed me up for basketball leagues, even moved us to a different apartment further from the corner where the gang activity was heaviest. But Chicago's South Side is like quicksand. The harder you fight to get out, the deeper it pulls you in. The tragedy that sealed my fate happened 2 days after my 13th birthday. I came home from school to find Miss Geneva collapsed in the kitchen, victim of a massive heart attack. The paramedics said she had probably been dead for hours, meaning she died alone while I was sitting in social studies class, complaining about homework that suddenly seemed completely meaningless. At the funeral, Agent Pat Williams, who had kept in touch with me over the years, explained that I'd be going back into the foster care system. But this time, there was no Miss Geneva to advocate for me, no church mother to make sure I ended up somewhere safe. I bounced between 3 different foster homes in 6 months. The first family was more interested in the check than the kid. The second family had their own problems with addiction and violence. The third family tried to help, but their teenage son was already gang-affiliated and saw me as either competition or recruitment. By the time I turned 14, I had learned a brutal truth. In Chicago's foster care system, especially for mixed-race kids with no family connections, survival meant making alliances with people who could protect you. And in my neighborhood, the only people with real power wore colors and carried guns. The gangster disciples had been watching me since Miss Geneva died. They knew I was smart, tough, and desperate. Exactly the kind of kid they could mold into a soldier. When they offered me a place to stay, food to eat, and protection from the predators who hunt vulnerable children, I didn't see it as joining a gang. I saw it as choosing family over foster care, survival over surrender. I was 14 years old, completely alone in the world, and the streets were offering me what the system couldn't: belonging, purpose, and the promise that nobody would ever hurt me again. That's how Jamal Robinson, the abandoned mixed-race kid from the South Side, became J-Rob, one of the most feared young soldiers in Chicago's deadliest gang. Miss Geneva had tried to save me. Agent Pat had tried to guide me. But in the end, the streets claimed another casualty. Or so I thought. What I didn't know was that God was writing a story of redemption that would take me from the projects to the pulpit, from gang leader to gospel preacher, from destroying families to healing communities. But first, I had to descend into hell so I could truly appreciate heaven when I found it. By 15, I wasn't just surviving on the South Side, I was thriving. The gangster disciples had given me what the foster care system couldn't: structure, loyalty, and a sense of purpose that went beyond just staying alive. But with that came expectations that would stain my soul in ways I'm still asking God to forgive. My first real test came on a cold February night in 2001. We got word that some vice lord from the West Side had been moving into our territory around 63rd and King Drive, selling drugs and disrespecting our colors. The older cats decided it was time to send a message, and they chose me to deliver it. J-Rob, you want to be family for real, or you want to keep playing games? That's what Big Mike asked me as he handed me a .38 revolver that felt heavier than anything I'd ever held. Tonight, you become a man, or you become a memory. I won't glorify what happened that night, because there's nothing glorious about a 15-year-old kid walking up to another teenager and pulling that trigger. But I will tell you this: when you're alone in the world, when you've been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love you, when your choice is between being a victim or being a survivor, you do things that the comfortable people in suburbia will never understand. The kid I shot survived, but something inside me died that night. The innocence that Miss Geneva had tried so hard to protect was gone forever, replaced by a hardness that would serve me well in the streets, but nearly cost me my soul. Word spread through the South Side. The mixed kid wasn't playing games anymore. Rivals started respecting my name, and my own gang started trusting me with bigger responsibilities. By 16, I was moving weight for the organization. By 17, I had my own corner and my own crew of younger kids who looked up to me the same way I had once looked up to Big Mike. The money was intoxicating. For a kid who had been eating cereal with water just a few years earlier, having thousands of dollars in cash felt like winning the lottery. I bought clothes that made me look older, jewelry that announced my status, and most importantly, I bought respect from people who had never given me anything but problems. But success in the game comes with a price that compounds daily. The paranoia, the violence, the constant awareness that every day could be your last. It changes you in ways that go deeper than personality. It rewrites your DNA, turns you into something that's part human, part predator, part ghost. By 18, I was running a crew of 30 soldiers across 3 different neighborhoods. We had operations in Englewood, North Lawndale, and parts of the West Side that technically belonged to other gangs but recognized our right to do business. I wasn't just a foot soldier anymore. I was a lieutenant in an organization that generated millions of dollars and controlled territory larger than some small towns. The violence was constant and brutal. Drive-by shootings were so common that the sound of gunfire was like background music in our neighborhood. Funerals were weekly events, and I attended more burials before my 20th birthday than most people do in a lifetime. Some of those bodies were rivals who had crossed us. Some were civilians who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Too many were young men from our own organization who had made mistakes that cost them their lives. I carried that weight differently than most people would expect. Every face haunted me. Every name whispered accusations in my dreams. Every mother's cry at every funeral reminded me that I was part of a machine that devoured young black men and spit out statistics. But I had learned to compartmentalize that pain, to bury it so deep that it couldn't interfere with the business of survival. The turning point came when I was 21. Agent Pat Williams, the same federal officer who had found me hiding under that bed 16 years earlier, walked into a restaurant where I was having dinner and sat down at my table like we were old friends. "Hello, Jamal," she said, using the name nobody in the streets knew anymore. "We need to talk." Pat had been tracking my rise through the organization for years. She showed me photographs, wiretap transcripts, financial records that painted a picture of my criminal career in devastating detail. The federal government had enough evidence to charge me with conspiracy, racketeering, drug trafficking, and accessory to multiple murders. "But that's not why I'm here," she continued. "I'm here because I remember the scared little boy I found hiding under that mattress, and I know he's still in there somewhere. I'm here to offer you a choice." The choice was simple but devastating. Cooperate with federal investigators to bring down the gang's leadership, or spend the rest of my life in federal prison. Most people would think that's an easy decision, but in the streets, cooperating with law enforcement isn't just betrayal. It's a death sentence that extends to your family, your friends, and anyone who has ever cared about you. I had 48 hours to decide whether I wanted to be a witness or a defendant. 48 hours to choose between loyalty to the people who had raised me and survival in a system that had already failed me once. That's when something happened that I still can't fully explain. Sitting in my apartment that night, surrounded by all the material success that the game had brought me, I found myself thinking about Miss Geneva for the first time in years. I could almost hear her voice telling me that I was better than what I had become, that the scared little boy she had loved was still worth saving. I got down on my knees in that apartment and did something I hadn't done since I was 13 years old. I prayed. Not for God to get me out of trouble, but for God to show me who I was supposed to be. For the first time in my adult life, I admitted that the person I had become wasn't the person Miss Geneva had tried to raise, wasn't the person Agent Pat had seen potential in, wasn't the person I was meant to be. That prayer didn't solve everything, but it opened a door in my heart that had been locked since the day Miss Geneva died. For the first time in 8 years, I allowed myself to imagine a life beyond the gang, beyond the violence, beyond the endless cycle of destruction that had consumed everyone I knew. 2 days later, I walked into the federal building downtown and told Agent Pat that I was ready to cooperate. Not because I wanted to hurt my gang family, but because I finally understood that the path I was on led to only two destinations: prison or death. And somewhere in my broken heart, I believed that Miss Geneva, and maybe even God, wanted something better for me. The decision to cooperate would make me a target for the rest of my life, but it was also the first step toward becoming the man I was created to be. I just didn't know it yet. The moment I agreed to cooperate with the federal government, my old life ended and a terrifying new one began. Within hours, I was relocated to a safe house on the north side of Chicago, surrounded by U.S. Marshals who treated me like both an asset and a threat. I had information that could dismantle one of Chicago's most violent gang organizations, but I was also a young black man who had blood on his hands and enemies who would kill me without hesitation. The next 18 months were the strangest of my life. I spent my days in federal offices, giving detailed testimony about murders, drug operations, and corruption that reached from the South Side streets to City Hall. I drew maps of territory boundaries, identified photographs of gang members, and provided evidence that would eventually lead to 47 indictments and convictions that decimated the Gangster Disciples leadership structure. But the nights were torture. Alone in safe houses that felt more like prisons, I was haunted by the faces of everyone I had betrayed. Not just the criminals, but the young men who had looked up to me, the mothers who had trusted me with their sons, the community that had seen me as protection rather than threat. The streets had painted me as a snitch, but the truth was more complicated. I was a man trying to save his own soul while helping the government destroy the only family I had ever known. Agent Pat Williams became more than my handler. She became the closest thing I had of family. During our long interviews, she would tell me stories about her own journey from the West Side projects to federal law enforcement, helping me understand that transformation was possible even for people who had done terrible things. Jamal, she told me during one particularly difficult session, you can't undo what you've done, but you can decide what you do next. The question is, what kind of man do you want to be for the rest of your life? That question haunted me more than any threat from my former gang. For 8 years, I had defined myself by my ability to survive, to command respect through fear, to build wealth through violence. But now, stripped of my colors and my crew, I had to figure out who Jamal Robinson really was underneath all the anger and trauma. The breakthrough came during my second year in witness protection. I was living in a small apartment in Milwaukee, working a legitimate job at a warehouse, trying to build a normal life under a fake identity. But the isolation was killing me slowly, and I found myself thinking about suicide more often than I cared to admit. That's when I met Pastor David Johnson at a small Baptist church where I had started attending services. Not because I was particularly religious, but because it was one of the few places where I could be around people without constantly looking over my shoulder. Pastor Johnson was a former gang member himself, someone who had found Christ after serving 15 years in state prison for armed robbery. He didn't know my real name or my history, but he saw something in me that reminded him of his younger self. Anger, pain, and a desperation for redemption that I couldn't articulate. After several weeks of watching me sit alone in the back pew, Pastor Johnson invited me to his office for what he called just a conversation between two men who understand streets. That conversation lasted 4 hours and changed my life forever. I told him everything about being abandoned by my mother, about Miss Geneva's death, about my years in the gang, about the lives I had taken and destroyed. I expected judgment, condemnation, maybe even rejection. Instead, Pastor Johnson listened with the kind of attention that made me feel heard for the first time in my adult life. Son, he said when I finished, you can't change your yesterday, but God can use your yesterday to change someone else's tomorrow. The same experiences that nearly destroyed, you can become the foundation for ministry that saves other young men from the path you walked. That night, I gave my life to Christ in a way that went deeper than any childhood prayer or desperate bargain with God. This was surrender, not just of my sins, but of my pain, my anger, my fear, and most importantly, my desire to control my own destiny. For the first time since Miss Geneva died, I wasn't alone in the world. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. The rage that had fueled my criminal career was replaced by something I had never experienced: peace. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of someone bigger than my problems. The nightmares didn't disappear, but they lost their power to control my days. The guilt remained, but it was tempered by forgiveness that felt as real as gravity. Pastor Johnson became my mentor, teaching me not just theology, but practical ministry skills. He showed me how to study the Bible, how to counsel people who had experienced trauma, how to build programs that could reach young men who reminded me of myself. Most importantly, he helped me understand that God doesn't waste experiences. Even the terrible ones can be redeemed and used for his purposes. After 2 years in Milwaukee, the federal trials were complete, and most of the gang leaders I had testified against were serving life sentences. Agent Pat Williams arranged for me to be relocated one final time, this time back to Chicago, where she believed I could make the greatest impact. The South Side needs someone who understands what those young men are going through, she told me. Someone who can speak their language, but point them in a different direction. You've paid your debt to society, Jamal. Now it's time to pay your debt to the community you helped damage. I returned to Chicago in 2006 as a completely different person. The 21-year-old gang leader who had left was now a 25-year-old minister with a calling to reach the unreachable, save the unsavable, and prove that God's grace is bigger than any mistake we could ever make. I rented a small apartment in Bronzeville, not far from where Miss Geneva had raised me, and began volunteering at local churches and community centers. I didn't advertise my past, but I didn't hide it either. When young men asked me how I knew so much about street life, I told them the truth. I had lived it, survived it, and found something better. The ministry that would eventually become Second Chance Church started in that small apartment, with me counseling gang members who were trying to leave the life, addicts who were seeking recovery, and mothers who were desperate to save their sons from the streets that had nearly consumed me. Every conversation was a chance to plant seeds of hope in soil that had been poisoned by generations of poverty, violence, and abandonment. Every young man who chose education over incarceration was a victory that helped heal the damage I had done during my years in the game. By 2008, I was ready to start something bigger, a church that could reach people who would never feel comfortable in traditional religious settings, a ministry that understood the streets but pointed people toward heaven, a community where former enemies could become spiritual family. I had no idea how powerful that ministry would become, or how God would use my story of redemption to transform one of Chicago's most violent neighborhoods. But I was finally ready to find out. In 2009, I started Second Chance Church in the basement of a community center on 79th Street, just blocks from where I had first learned to survive on Chicago's South Side. Our first service had 12 people, a few recovering addicts I had been counseling, some mothers from the neighborhood who were tired of burying their sons, and Agent Pat Williams, who had become like family to me over the years. I preached for 20 minutes about God's ability to transform the worst situations into testimonies of hope. I used my own life as the primary example. How an abandoned mixed-race kid had become a gang leader, then a federal witness, and finally a minister who believed that nobody was too far gone for God's grace. Word spread through the South Side faster than I expected. Not because people were excited about another church, but because they were curious about the former gang member who was preaching salvation instead of selling destruction. Some came to mock, some came to test me, but many came because they recognized something authentic in my message that they couldn't find anywhere else. By our 6th month, we had outgrown the community center and moved to a rented storefront that could hold about 100 people. The congregation was unlike anything Chicago had ever seen. Former gang members sitting next to their victims' mothers, police officers worshiping alongside ex-felons they had once arrested, teenagers who were choosing education over incarceration. My preaching style was unpolished, but undeniably real. I talked about redemption like someone who had experienced it, about second chances like someone who had been given one, about God's love like someone who had found it in the most impossible circumstances. I used street language when it helped people understand spiritual truths, and I wasn't afraid to call out the systems and mindsets that kept our communities trapped in cycles of destruction. The real breakthrough came when we started the Brothers Keeper program, a mentorship initiative that paired former gang members with current gang members who wanted out of the life. The program worked because we understood the streets in ways that traditional intervention programs couldn't. We knew that you can't just tell someone to leave the gang without providing them with alternative sources of income, protection, and belonging. Marcus Thompson, my former lieutenant from the Gangster Disciples who had also found Christ while serving time, became my ministry partner. The same organizational skills that had made our criminal enterprise successful now made our outreach efforts incredibly effective. We had teams working throughout the South Side, building relationships with gang leaders, partnering with schools and social service agencies, and most importantly, demonstrating that transformation was possible. The program's first major success came when we helped Demetrius D. Money Jackson leave the Vice Lords after 8 years of gang life. D. Money had been shot 3 times, arrested 12 times, and was facing a potential life sentence when we reached out to him. Through months of counseling, job training, and spiritual mentorship, we helped him transition from street life to legitimate work as a community organizer. When D. Money stood up in our church and shared his testimony about leaving the gang life, there wasn't a dry eye in the building. His transformation inspired other young men to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was a different path available to them. The church grew rapidly, but not in a traditional way. We didn't have one building. We had influence throughout the South Side. Our services happened in community centers, park pavilions, high school auditoriums, wherever people needed hope. We baptized converts in pools, fire hydrants, even Lake Michigan when the weather was right. Media attention was inevitable, but not always welcome. Local news stations did features on the former gang leader turned preacher, and while the publicity brought donors and volunteers, it also brought unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies who still didn't trust me, and from gang members who saw me as either a traitor or a threat. The real validation came from the community itself. Crime rates dropped in neighborhoods where we had active programs. High school graduation rates increased among young men who participated in our mentorship initiatives. Families that had been torn apart by gang violence started healing through our family counseling programs. One of our biggest victories came when we negotiated a peace treaty between 2 rival gangs that had been warring for over a decade. Using relationships I had maintained from my street days and spiritual authority I had gained through ministry, we brought together gang leaders who hadn't been in the same room without trying to kill each other. The peace talks took place in our church sanctuary with mothers who had lost children to gang violence serving as witnesses and peacekeepers. It wasn't a perfect solution. Gang activity didn't disappear overnight, but it was a beginning. For the first time in years, children in those neighborhoods could walk to school without fear of being caught in crossfire. 3 years after starting the church, I married Keisha Williams, a social worker who had grown up on the West Side and understood the challenges facing urban communities. She had known about my past, but chose to see my future. Our wedding was held at Washington Park, and the guest list looked like a United Nations of redemption. Former gang members and their victims' families, police officers and ex-felons, all celebrating what God had done in our lives. The most powerful moment of our wedding came when Agent Pat Williams, the federal officer who had found me as a child and guided me as an adult, walked me down the aisle. She had become the closest thing I had to a parent, and having her there felt like Miss Geneva's blessing from heaven. Today, 15 years after walking out of federal protection, Second Chance Church operates in 6 locations across Chicago's South Side and West Side. We've helped over 2,000 young men leave gang life, assisted hundreds of ex-offenders in finding legitimate employment, and seen countless families restored through the power of the gospel. The Brothers Keeper program has been replicated in 12 other cities, and we regularly host delegations from law enforcement agencies, social service organizations, and churches who want to understand how formerly incarcerated individuals can become effective community leaders. I still live on the South Side, in a modest house in a neighborhood where I can stay connected to the community I'm called to serve. Instead of counting drug money, I count souls saved. Instead of managing criminal enterprises, I manage community programs that provide alternatives to street life. Instead of running from police, I work alongside them to make Chicago safer for everyone. The streets that once knew me as J-Rob now know me as Pastor Jamal. The corners where I used to post up gang members are now places where we post up prayer teams and community outreach workers. The same influence I once used to spread violence and addiction is now used to spread hope and healing. When people ask me about my transformation, I tell them the truth. I didn't change because I got caught, and I didn't change because I got scared. I changed because God showed me that the same leadership gifts He had given me could be used to build His kingdom instead of destroying His people. The most feared gang leader on Chicago's South Side became the most unlikely minister the city had ever witnessed. And every Sunday, as I look out at congregations filled with people who represent every kind of brokenness and every possibility of healing, I'm reminded that God doesn't waste anything, not even the worst mistakes of our past. He could take a child abandoned on the streets and turn him into someone who guides others home. He could take someone who was part of the problem and make him part of the solution. That's the real miracle of my story. Not that I survived the streets, but that God took everything the streets had taught me and used it to save the people the streets were trying to destroy. From gang leader to gospel preacher. That's the kind of transformation that only makes sense in the economy of grace. Miss Geneva was right when she used to tell me that God had a plan for my life. She just never could have imagined that the plan would take me through hell first, so I could come back and help other people find their way to heaven. If this story moves you, share it with someone who needs to believe that no matter how far they've fallen, God specializes in impossible comebacks. The same God who saved me from the streets is still in the business of turning mess into ministry, pain into purpose, and broken lives into powerful testimonies of His grace.